Thank you, everyone. I call to order this hearing of the Subcommittee on Competition Policy, Antitrust and Consumer Rights, entitled Breaking the News, Journalism, Competition, and the Effects of Market Power on a Free Press. I want to welcome our witnesses. We have votes going on right now, so Senator Lee and I will be going back and forth, as will some of the other senators during this time. But I want to thank him and his staff for working with us to put together this hearing, as well as my own staff, Mark and Avery and Kagan, for the work they do every day. So some of you may know my dad was a newspaperman as a reporter and a columnist in the Twin Cities. He covered it all in an estimated 8,400 columns and about 12 million words, in which he interviewed everyone from Ronald Reagan, Senator Lee, to Ginger Rogers to Chicago Bears coach Mike Ditka. I won't say which interview was his favorite. He was proud to be a newspaperman, and as you can imagine, in my house growing up, it was impossible to forget the importance of a free press. And that is what we are here to talk about today, to talk about the critical work news outlets around the country are doing and explore solutions to some of the existential challenges facing journalism. It is truly local news that reports on the issues that people face in their everyday lives. I think about the Fargo Forum in my home state, actually, of Minnesota, next to North Dakota, that includes Moorhead, Minnesota, when the floods, catastrophic floods hit the area. That newspaper and the local broadcasters were the one covering it, warning people, giving them news updates all the time. I think about investigative journalism at the local level with everything from city council scandals, not that those ever exist, to all kinds of things that would not be covered. I think of the sports games for high schools and the pride that people have in their local community events. All of this brings the community together in different ways. They find stuff out. They have common information that they can look at, in addition to what they see nationally, which sometimes can see very distant and larger than life. What our local news does is oftentimes tells the story of what my dad called ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And as I said, this work not only connects communities, it also helps policymakers better understand how issues are impacting their constituents and helps them to figure out what needs to be done. That's why it's critical that we ensure that local news can not only survive but thrive, particularly as outlets face off with some of the biggest companies the world has ever known. Local news is facing a crisis in the U.S. Since 2005, about 2,200 local newspapers across America have closed, and many of the ones that remain are on life support. Between 2008 and 2019, newsroom employment fell by 51%. With much smaller newsrooms, surviving outlets are often mere shells of their former selves. I was thinking about that really troubling photo from the Denver Post where the journalists, they show a picture of everyone happily smiling, and then a few years later they show the hollowed out images, the silhouettes of the journalists who are no longer there, less than half of them left. As you know, local newspapers aren't closing or drastically reducing their coverage because of a lack of talent or a passion for the work. And yes, many of them have online presence and they have tried their best to do that. But in fact, their real problem is a lack of revenue. Ad revenue for U.S. newspapers plummeted from over $37 billion in 2008 to less than $9 billion in 2020. $37 billion in 2008 to less than $9 billion in 2020. What else happened during that time? Well, if you see the ad revenues for the world's biggest companies, you'll see the exact opposite story being told. Facebook and Google, worth over $2.6 trillion combined as I speak, became digital advertising titans during that same time. Just yesterday, Google reported $61 billion in advertising revenue in a single 3-month period, a 33% jump. I say to my colleagues, a 33% jump from the same period just last year. Look at those numbers. 61 billion in just 3 months for one company, 61 billion, and you have U.S. newspaper revenue from 2008 to 2020 going from 37 billion to 9 billion. As one of my colleagues said during the presidential race, do the math. It's not that hard to figure it out. Do the math. These big tech companies are not friends to journalism. They are raking in ad dollars while taking news content, feeding it to their users, and refusing to offer fair compensation. And they're making money on consumers' backs by using the content produced by news outlets to suck up as much data about each reader as they can. So it's kind of a double whammy, right? They're the big guys, they're bringing in the content, they're not compensating for it as they should, and at the same time, they are getting the revenue off the consumers that read the content that then don't go to the ones that are producing the content. So then that data really exacerbates what is already a huge divide in where that revenue goes. And how much do these companies care about retaining this power over the news and reader data? They care a lot. Enough to even hold entire countries, industrialized nations, hostage, as we saw happen last year in Australia. When Google was told by the government that they would have to pay for the news content that they wanted to use, this is the Australian government, the company essentially said, we're out of here, and threatened to pull Google search out of an entire country. That's what monopolies do. That's what you do when you can do it because you have over 90% of the search market. Google didn't follow through on its threat, in part because there was so much international pressure to stop them from doing it. But Facebook actually switched off all news on its platform to protest the law, only reversing course after a few days under immense outside pressure. And what does big tech's dominance over the news mean for Americans? As I've already noted, less revenue for local news, fewer journalists to do in-depth, high-quality reporting, more exposure to misinformation, and fewer reliable sources. While the rise of these platforms has sometimes meant a larger audience for some news outlets, that hasn't translated to increased ad revenue. For years, I've heard concerns about things like the platforms do not provide adequate branding for news outlets' original content on the platforms, that they hoard for themselves all of the data on the users that access the news content produced by news providers through their platform, that they publish large snippets of newspapers' content to attract users to the platform without any compensation at all to that news outlet. And repeated complaints to Google and Facebook from newspapers and broadcasters are simply ignored because that's what a monopolist does. They can ignore things. They can use their market dominance to elbow others out and retain their control. That's why we need to step in to level the playing field, as so many other countries are doing. We're here today to talk about how we'll give these news outlets a fighting chance. I teamed up with my colleague, Senator Kennedy, to lead the Bipartisan Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Our bill gives local news outlets the ability to collectively negotiate for fair compensation with companies like Google and Facebook so they can continue to invest in the kind of quality reporting that keeps us all informed. And we're working with our bipartisan partners in the House of Representatives on improvements to the bill. We're ready to take all ideas and address all challenges raised by our colleagues because we believe there's a way to do this fairly, to make sure that all news outlets are included, to better help correct the imbalance in bargaining power between newspapers and big tech. We're looking at this, a clear framework for good faith negotiations between news organizations and big tech, mechanisms to help make those negotiations go smoothly, protections to prevent discrimination against news outlets based on the political views that they express, and provisions to better ensure that the interests of small independent news outlets are paramount in any joint negotiation. I also introduced the Future of Local News Act to help local outlets chart the path forward as they recover from the pandemic. And I'm working with my colleagues to pass the Local Journalism Sustainability Act to help Americans pay for newspaper subscriptions. So all this said, if we were living in a perfect world where we didn't have monopoly search engines and monopoly platforms with, in some cases, over 90% of the market, and we were able to pass some of the bills that I have, my colleagues have on a bipartisan basis, Senator Grassley, to even that playing field, maybe we wouldn't be where we are. But we are here because we have a crisis going on when we've lost over 2,000 news outlets. And that is why we have come upon this targeted approach to protect the First Amendment, to protect the news organizations that we believe are so critical to making sure that the First Amendment stays strong. We need to recognize that what separates the news from the vast majority of our other industries is its crucial role in our democratic system of government. That's why our founders enshrined freedom of the press in the First Amendment. So when the exercise of monopoly power results in a market failure in our news industry, it's critically important for our democracy that we act. Local journalism is also important to local communities and their economies. The closures of local newspapers can lead to higher municipal borrowing costs and increased government inefficiency. This means less money for schools, hospitals, and roads. Thomas Jefferson said that our first objective should be to leave open, quote, all avenues to truth, end quote, and that the best way of doing that is through, quote, the freedom of the press, end quote. That rings especially true today. As elected leaders, we certainly may not always like what we read or hear in the news. I think all of us can relate to this. But I think we can all agree that ensuring the future of a vibrant and independent free press is essential to the fabric of our democracy and the American way of life. Thank you. I now turn it over to my colleague, Senator Lee, for his opening statement.
Thanks so much, Chairwoman Klobuchar. I think today's hearing is important. I look forward to it for a variety of reasons. I think it'll be illustrative on a number of fronts. The first involves what ails the news industry. Now, news publishers do, in fact, have a legitimate beef with the Google, Facebook ad duopoly. That's a problem. And Google and Facebook's unrivaled market power in digital advertising imposes a sort of de facto tax on every business that places or makes money from ads, which is a large swath of the 21st century economy. And I'm grateful to you, Madam Chair, along with Senators Grassley and Blumenthal, for working with me in my office to help tackle that two-headed hydra, which does need to be tackled, and we have a lot of agreement on that issue. I also think that it's important to ask the question whether that's really news publishers' only problem. I don't think it is. In fact, I think it's far from that. Now, our witnesses today may not exemplify it. I'll assume for purposes of our discussion today that they don't. But there are a number of voices within the mainstream news media that's whose publications are rife with shoddy and extraordinarily biased reporting that many consumers simply don't trust, or in any event don't want to spend money consuming. There are too many examples to cite all of them, but I think it's important to point out at least a few of them. You have the Steele Dossier, a work of pure fiction, funded by the Clinton campaign and breathlessly, dutifully reported on by news media outlets across the country. Blinded by their own impassioned hatred of President Trump, they helped spread the dossier's lies, even after it had been proven demonstrably literally false. And we're still waiting on the retractions. Or what about the Washington Post defamation of Covington Catholic High School student Nicholas Sandman? Or the Post's fawning description of Islamic State leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as a quote-unquote austere religious scholar? And who can forget the New York Times reporting that Russia had placed bounties on the heads of American soldiers, which was quickly, dutifully parroted by other outlets in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election. It wasn't until after President Biden was inaugurated that they felt comfortable admitting that the story didn't hold up. Mission accomplished, I suppose. I know Senator Cotton will recall how his suggestion that COVID-19 may have been leaked from a lab in Wuhan was scoffed at and derided rather viciously in a series of personal attacks against him for saying that. And as it turns out, he was right. So how did the media respond? Well, they stealth-edited their original reporting to pretend that it never happened. And just last month, just in the last few weeks, the Salt Lake Tribune's editorial board literally said that if Utah were a more just, decent place, that the National Guard would be mobilized to, in effect, hold people under house arrest orders if they were unvaccinated. So the fiery but mostly peaceful protests of the summer of 2020, the denials that critical race theory is being taught in the schools, these things add to and constitute part of this list, along with quote-unquote temporary inflation, and the list goes on and on. But look, today's news media is often a source of misinformation. And it's one of the leading causes, when it does this, of social discord and political upheaval, especially when it doesn't even acknowledge its mistakes, and especially when its mistakes appear so frequently, so consistently, so constantly to lean one direction and not the other. The self-proclaimed Fourth Estate loves to preach to the masses about democracy dying in darkness while they themselves turn out the lights. On top of the fact that the mainstream media is selling something that in many cases people don't want, there are also the series of poor business decisions that have been made within that industry. During the years in which they made comfortable profits, almost nothing, in some of the companies at least, was reinvested into the business to innovate and to grow in response to changing technologies. And when the market changed with the advent of the internet, forcing newspapers for the first time to face meaningful competition for advertising dollars, many publishers just went all in on an advertising-only business model, even abandoning subscription revenue for online content. The bottom line here is that whatever the challenges that the news publishers are facing as a result of big tech's dominance over digital advertising, for some publishers, perhaps for many, they've got other problems. And for some of them, perhaps for many, it may involve inferior product quality and failure to take into account evolving technologies to adapt their business model. The second thing to set straight here is that what we should do about this, or rather what we should not do, also matters. The last thing I think we should do is to try to solve this or any other competition problem by saying that it's okay to just accept a cartel, that it's okay to make changes to the laws to encourage the formation and allow the formation and thereby encourage the formation of a cartel, as many publishers are requesting. And make no mistake, that is what this is. That is what this call is for. And that is what the JCPA would do. We're not talking about an arguably pro-competitive type of competitor collaboration on some sort of run-of-the-mill joint venture. This would be competitors themselves colluding with the approval of law against a common business partner in order to fix problems that they're facing. Now, there is a lot that Senator Klobuchar and I have agreed on, and one of the many things that we've agreed also a lot on a lot of areas within antitrust law. We held a fantastic hearing back in 2013, I think it was, when we talked about cartels. And Senator Klobuchar said cartels have no other purpose other than to rob consumers. And I agree. And I certainly think that we're not going to be better off by giving a cartel formation hall pass to an industry that's been ravaged by a number of other problems that I've identified. This ends up passing those problems along to consumers, the very same consumers that are being forced to, in many cases, accept an inferior product and partisan hackery and so much else that goes along with it. Now, I know publishers, including some of our witnesses today, believe that they would benefit, but legislation like the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act would do far more to help the New York Times and far more to help the Washington Post than it would be a benefit for local journalism in Salt Lake City or in Minneapolis. The only way to fix this is by encouraging competition and allowing it and promoting it, not eliminating it, and certainly not giving people a hall pass to engage in contact that would challenge, threaten, and undermine it. And finally, as I understand, the authors of the JCPA are rewriting that bill in an effort to mirror some reforms in Australia and the music licensing system in the United States. But I want to register my frustration that the majority hasn't shared draft text with it. We haven't seen that draft text. It's nearly impossible for senators and witnesses to prepare for a hearing where the draft of the legislative solution is still floating apparently around K Street, but not publicly available for senators and for the American people, for that matter, to review. So with all that said, I look forward to this hearing and hearing from our witnesses and their contributions.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. I'd also note that the venue bill, we didn't have any hearing on that, and we are here having a hearing on this, and I'm, of course, the lead author of that. But I think I went through after our last discussion on my innovation bill, and we found dozens of bills, including led by Republicans, where the hearings were either at the subcommittee level or there wasn't a hearing, and we were able to have a markup and a discussion of the bill based on hearings such as the one we're having today. So I just think after we're done with this hearing, we should look at that history, because we would be putting on hold the venue bill and many others if that was our new standard that would be suddenly adopted this week. I'm now going to introduce the witnesses that are before us today from the local news area, something near and dear to my heart and the reason I feel so strongly about this bill. Jennifer Bertetto, thank you for being here. Did I say that correctly? Thank you. Is the president and CEO of Trim Total Media, located outside of Pittsburgh. The company operates a daily paper with a circulation of approximately 35,000, 11 weekly community newspapers with smaller circulations, and a handful of monthly newspapers. Mr. Bertetto has been with the company, Ms. Bertetto has been with the company for more than 20 years, holding positions ranging from regional advertising director to chief operating officer to president. Her first job in the news business was taking baseball scores for the local baseball and soccer leagues at the age of 16. She also serves on the board of the News Media Alliance. Next up, Joel Oxley. Mr. Oxley is the general manager of WTOP News. For anyone in the DC area, you've heard WTOP. It is a DC area radio station owned by Hubbard Broadcasting that happens to be located in Minnesota. WTOP has over 100 local journalists, and it is known for its local news programming. The station first went on the air in 1926. Mr. Oxley joined WTOP in 1992 and worked his way up the ranks in sales and sales management to general manager in 1998. Dan Gaynor. Mr. Gaynor is a vice president of Free Speech America and Business for the Media Research Center, a nonprofit organization focused on alleged liberal media bias. He is a commentator for Fox and has a regular spot on the One America News Network. Prior to joining the Media Research Center, Mr. Gaynor was an editor at several newspapers, including the Washington Times and the Baltimore News American. Next, last but not least, Daniel Francis. Mr. Francis, Dr. Francis, is a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School, where he writes about regulation and competition. His research focuses on antitrust as well as constitutional and other rules that facilitate, constrain, and shape regulatory action and competitive processes. He has a particular interest in digital and high-tech markets. Dr. Francis previously served as the Federal Trade Commission as senior counsel to the director, associate director for digital markets, and ultimately deputy director. Another witness that's here with us virtually, Hal Singer. Dr. Singer is an economist who has researched, published, and testified on competition-related issues in a wide variety of industries, including media, pharmaceuticals, sports, and finance. Late last year, he published a paper commissioned by the News Media Alliance about the impact of Google and Facebook on newspapers, finding that Google and Facebook undercompensate newspapers for content and advertising. If the witnesses now would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you give before the subcommittee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated, and I will now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes of testimony each. And as I noted, senators have votes. We've invited all the senators on the committee, as we always do, to this hearing. And so we will begin with you, Ms. Bertetto. Thank you.
Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. My name is Jennifer Bertetto, and I'm the president and CEO of TribTotal Media. We are a small publisher that delivers news, information, and advertising to 4 counties in southwestern Pennsylvania. Our company is 272 employees strong with daily and weekly newspaper circulations and hyper-local community websites that comprise our neighborhood news network. Our newsroom is a collective of 88 journalists, photojournalists, editors, and designers. Our high-quality and award-winning journalism is why our flagship website, triblive.com, draws more than 300 million page views each year. TribTotal Media's commitment to delivering high-quality journalism dates back to our founding in the 1800s. Our company was transformed in 1970 when Richard Mellon-Scaife purchased our local publishing company. We have remained focused on providing local news to our communities. But with the rise of the internet, we recognized that we needed to shift our focus from print to digital. Having done that, we're proud to provide our flagship website for free, a testament to our commitment to the community and to making news accessible. I've worked my entire career in the news industry, starting out of college and working my way up to president and CEO in 2015. I've seen firsthand the changing nature of news consumption and distribution, and can attest that the news industry faces a dire and insurmountable challenge, leveling the playing field against the vast power exerted by dominant digital platforms. I'd like to discuss 3 main points. First, local newspapers are under incredible financial pressure, and we must ensure that the people who create high-quality journalistic content are compensated for it. With the growth of the digital platforms, we saw our readership shift to fewer subscriptions and then cancellations. To become profitable, in 2015, we restructured our business. We closed 2 newspapers, sold 3 others, and made the difficult decision to lay off more than 150 employees. In 2016, we published our last print edition of the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review and moved our reporting in that market online. These decisions were essential to stay in business, but they have ramifications to this day. Several communities in southwestern Pennsylvania are considered news deserts, not served by any local newspaper. Second, access to news online has become concentrated on 2 platforms, Facebook and Google, which serve as gatekeepers and determine how news is displayed, prioritized, monetized, without compensating the journalists that create the content they rely on. Tech platforms have become gatekeepers, controlling access to news, my company's original content, on their sites. Sadly, most Americans get their news from these platforms, who are raking in record profits by simply curating content, a word that has subtly devalued the painstaking work of real reporting by journalists. On Google alone, 65% of users don't leave their site to click through to a newspaper's website, depriving publishers of the traffic and ad dollars it brings. Some say the newspaper industry has failed to modernize, and that's nonsense. Even with restructuring and enhanced digital offerings, no matter what we did, it was not enough to level the playing field. Small publishers are stuck between a rock and a hard place. We carry no weight in negotiations with platforms. We do not have the resources or the stature to bring them to the table. But there is a solution to the problem. The Journalism Competition and Preservation Act would give publishers a seat at the table to negotiate fair terms for the value of our journalism. Thanks to the leadership of Chairwoman Klobuchar and Senator Kennedy, the Jcpa would provide a limited, safe harbor period for news publishers, irrespective of size or political persuasion, to negotiate collectively with the platforms for fair compensation for the use of our content. It's imperative that journalists are fairly compensated, and the Jcpa would allow us the opportunity to seek just that. The bill does not prescribe the outcome, but it allows the opportunity to seek fair compensation, requiring the parties to negotiate in good faith. To receive fair compensation for our work would enable small publishers like my company to invest more in our communities, hire more reporters, increase quality, fact-based news. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing.
Next up, Mr. Oxley.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Joel Oxley, and I am the Senior Vice President, General Manager of All News Radio station WTOP-FM, WTOP.com, and FederalNewsNetwork.com, which are all owned by Hubbard Broadcast. user traffic. Second, anti-competitive terms of service and a take-it-or-leave-it approach leave local broadcasters with a below-market sliver of those advertising revenues derived through their products. For local broadcasters and our viewers and listeners who rely on quality journalism, this is a real catch-22. To attract online user traffic through the major platforms, yet the terms of access dictated by the online platforms devalue our product. For example, not only is WTOP being compensated by Facebook and Google for its content, WTOP is actually not being compensated. WTOP is actually paying to make sure its content is being accessed on their platforms. Even more concerning is the degree to which certain platforms commoditize news content with little regard for the quality and veracity of the story. This puts fact-based reporting like ours on par with unsubstantiated clickbait as we fight for user eyeballs in both platform news feeds and search results. There is no doubt that tech platforms and their algorithms prioritize content that favors sensationalism over hard journalism. The dominant online platforms have flourished, siphoning off huge amounts of advertising revenues that are the lifeblood of free local journalism. Consider the big storm that just blew through the Northeast over the weekend, a nor'easter, with blizzard conditions. Tons of work at a lot of cost and time for local broadcasters to cover it for millions of people, but not for Facebook, Google, and the like. They simply take our coverage and profit from it, and virtually nothing comes back to us. But without local news, my guess is a lot of people would have not evacuated places like Cape Cod last weekend, and lives would have been risked. We just can't have that. In conclusion, this committee can address these concerns through the passage of the Jcpa. The NAB thanks Chairwoman Klobuchar and Senator Kennedy for reintroducing the Jcpa, a targeted, common-sense proposal. The NAB strongly supports the Jcpa, which would level the playing field by creating a temporary safe harbor for broadcasters and certain digital publications to jointly negotiate with dominant online platforms regarding the terms and conditions by which their content may be accessed online. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oxley. Next up, thank you for being here, Mr. Francis.
Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me here to testify today. As a former federal antitrust enforcer, I strongly support the subcommittee's focus on digital monopoly, and I want to acknowledge the seriousness of the difficulties that many publishers are facing across the country today while doing some of our most important work. But I cannot think of anything the country needs less, now or ever, than a national news media cartel. I want to make just 3 points. Point number 1, cartels are the supreme evil of antitrust. They're so reliably harmful that we extradite and imprison people who form them. They're automatically illegal in civil litigation with no justification allowed at law. And for decades, the Justice Department has had a flagship policy project of fighting cartels and opposing exemptions just like this one. Now, Congress has licensed cartels a handful of times over the 130 years of our antitrust laws, but always with great caution and not always with happy results. Point 2, I think the real complaint that I hear from the publishing industry is not so much about monopoly, but is rather about property rights on the internet. So I appreciate that publishers complain that platforms and users can share links to websites and can give fair use previews of news websites that are a sentence or two long without paying. And they argue that that's evidence of monopsony power because platforms are profiting and they're not paying, or not paying nearly so much, for those rights. But this is not evidence of monopsony power. Platforms aren't linking and previewing for free because they're monopsonists exercising buyer power. It's because our property laws, very wisely, don't give a website owner, whether it's an owner of a news website or something else, the power to veto or tax linking or fair use previewing of that website. And it's pretty easy to see that this has nothing to do with monopsony power because no one pays for it. We could, if someone has the coding ability in this room, we could start an app today and link and preview websites without paying for that privilege. Our law gives everyone that freedom. And I think that's a really good thing. Links are the lifeblood of the internet. Imagine how hard it would be to write even a traditional article or book if you couldn't cite a source or quote a sentence or two without paying for that privilege. And now imagine the consequences of that rule for our internet today. So despite the framing, my strong sense is that this is not really about monopoly or monopsony at all. It's a request to dramatically expand profit rights on the internet. And then to allow that property right to be sold by a new national news cartel with major media conglomerates at the helm. I think whatever antitrust reform we need today, and I think we need some, this is not that. Point 3, I think we're going to hear today about countervailing power. I think that's a red herring. It's true that in economic theory, if you have a single dominant buyer, there is an argument that total welfare can be improved if you let the suppliers form a cartel, at least in the perfect world of theory. But I don't think that's applicable here for 2 reasons. Number 1, I don't see evidence of monopsony power here at all, despite the size of the platforms. Again, platforms aren't linking and previewing for free because of buyer power. They're linking and previewing for free because that right, that freedom is theirs under our property law today. So this wouldn't be a cartel that would correct buyer power. It would create new seller power. That's a monopoly surcharge on all the news in the United States, cascading down the supply chain, driving up prices that are already too high. And second, the harm would far outweigh any good. Despite the size of the platforms, it actually doesn't look a lot like they hold monopoly power in markets for news today. But a national news cartel sure would be a monopolist. I think this subcommittee would be really concerned if even 2 of the major publishers were to propose a merger. The idea that we might put all of them together under one roof to agree on rates and terms and business models strikes me as a consumer's nightmare. Every week, the antitrust agencies hear pretty creative, but sometimes fragile, blackboard economic theories about why we should tolerate harmful conduct. I don't think the agencies would accept this argument, and I don't think Congress should either. I think the best thing we can do for competition in news is significantly increase our funding for the antitrust enforcers. I think that's the most urgent need we face. Thanks for inviting me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next up, Dr. Singer, who is here in person, so thank you.
Thank you to the subcommittee. Thank you to the subcommittee for inviting me to speak today on this most serious issue. I want to begin on a slightly lighter note, however, by giving a shout out to my mom, who turned 90 last month, is watching this hearing the old-fashioned way on C-SPAN, and has not forgiven me to this day for becoming an economist rather than a lawyer. The economic concepts here are complex and require a lot of ink, but I will try to boil them down to just a few by answering 3 questions. 1, what is the competition problem this bill seeks to solve? 2, what are the social harms that flow from the competition problem? And 3, how would a targeted bill address the competition problem? Now, regarding the competition problem, 2 platforms, Google and Facebook, have monopolized the digital advertising industry. Google and Facebook capture approximately 61% of all digital advertising dollars because of their ability to collect consumer data across the web. 70% of referral traffic to newspapers originate from just these 2 sites. This market power makes news publishers completely beholden to the dominant platforms for viewers and advertising dollars. And the resulting power imbalance ensures that the market rate for accessing news content will always be below competitive levels. Google and Facebook achieved their dominance in the mid-aughts with the acquisition of countless competitors, complementors like Instagram and YouTube, as well as critical input suppliers in ad tech like DoubleClick and AdMob. Also in the mid-aughts, and not by coincidence, newspapers began losing advertising, mainly to the platforms. According to Pew Research, newsroom advertising declined from $37.8 billion in 2008 to $8.8 billion in 2020. And over the same time period, newsroom employees declined from 71,070 to 30,820. If these trends are left unchecked, we might not have local newspapers in the near future. Now, the reason why Google scrapes, indexes, and posts news publisher content for free is because it can. It's like a school bully eating a smaller child's lunch. So long as market forces are allowed to dictate the payments for accessing news publisher content, the access price will remain at 0, and news publishers will be deprived of the billions of dollars a year of value created for the platforms. Now, turning to my second question, in addition to the private harms, the underpayment to news publishers results in underemployment of journalists and other news employees, as well as a host of other social ills associated with local news deserts, including less competent local governments, greater spread of partisanship and misinformation, removal of economic stimulus to local economies, and a reduction in the diversity of viewpoints. And turning to my third and final question, a targeted intervention similar to the negotiation framework adopted in Australia would solve the competition problem and mitigate the associated social harms by doing three things. First, it could permit a coalition of news publishers to form a joint negotiating entity to alleviate the power imbalance. No news publisher would ever unilaterally shut down access to Google and Facebook. To do so would be suicidal. Second, the bill could compel the platforms to negotiate in good faith for the access rights. Third, if the good faith negotiation does not produce an agreement, the coalition of news publishers, but not broadcasters, could invoke arbitration rights. At that point, a panel of arbitrators would decide, using baseball-style arbitration, whose estimate of the value added to the platform by all the members of the coalition was closest to fair market value for accessing the content in the absence of the power imbalance. Now, granting a narrow exemption to antitrust laws to address underpayments to vulnerable input providers finds precedent in both the labor exemption and the farm cooperative exemption to the antitrust law. And other countries, such as Australia, which have employed a similar intervention to what I call for here, have seen immediate rewards to publishers for their interventions. Now, relative to Australia's model, what I'm calling for would be more favorable to small publishers, as it would not permit any large individual newspaper to avail itself of the good faith negotiation or arbitration rights. Only news publishers that remain in the coalition would be entitled to those rights. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very, very much. And now our remaining witness who's appearing remotely is Dan Gaynor, Vice President, Free Speech America and Business for the Media Research Center. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Gaynor.
Thank you. Chairperson Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity today to speak about one of my favorite topics, local journalism. I've worked as an editor on 3 different local daily newspapers, as well as an editor at 2 weeklies and editor and associate publisher at a third. The best, and honestly, the most fun jobs I've ever had were in local news. If I could snap my fingers and fix local news, I would. I would hazard a guess that every single member of this committee would do the same. But the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act of 2021 does not fix that problem. It's a well-intentioned attempt to level the playing field between big tech and local journalism, but that's not what it does. It seems premised on a misinterpretation of history, that somehow local journalism was killed by a few big tech companies. It was not. How do I know? I was there. I was there working in local journalism as news outlets brought in 20, 25, or 30% profits year after year and didn't reinvest those epic gains. Newspapers consolidated because delivery became difficult in rush hour traffic and more readers turned to TV news. Baltimore, where I grew up, went from 3 dailies down to 1 in less than a decade. None of that was caused by the internet. I was director of new media for a weekly chain as the internet began to catch on. I watched as news organizations downplayed the threat and posted their content online for free. Sclerotic news outlets were unable or unwilling to respond to the opportunities online, and so they were dissected by the competition. The Great Recession took a particular toll on local businesses, and that meant advertisers stopped advertising. And COVID restrictions were just another example of how the heavy hand of government harmed local news. That's the background that brings us here today to discuss the future of journalism. The Jcpa allows big media companies to ignore antitrust laws and work together. That isn't fixing the problem of having a big tech advertising cabal. It's simply adding another cabal to negotiate with it. Allowing a few of the largest and most powerful media companies to act as proxies for others only ensures that big firms will secure deals that benefit them. We all want trustworthy local journalism that helps inform the public as well as holds powerful people accountable. Except that's not how corporate media have handled local journalism in the past. Local outlets were treated as cash cows. Big corporations milked them and slaughtered their remains. This law would only serve to support huge existing corporate media instead of independent media. Corporate news organizations don't need our help. The New York Times just spent $550 million in cash purchasing The Athletic, which, according to journalist Aaron Pilhofer, covers 270 plus sports teams in more than 47 local markets. The Times has placed itself in direct competition with every local news site for the same pool of subscribers, he wrote. Times already had more than 8 million paid subscribers. And the Times even just bought the popular game Wordle for a price in the low 7 figures. So why are we helping them? The Washington area used to have a thriving chain of community weeklies. The Execs were founded in 1959 and grew to 550,000 in circulation in suburban Maryland. They were closed down by their owners, the Washington Post, in 2015. In 2021, the Post achieved record-breaking digital advertising. And it's also owned by big tech billionaire Jeff Bezos. He purchased the company in 2013, 2 years before it killed the chain of weeklies. So why are we helping them? Corporate media already benefit from better treatment by social media algorithms and smaller and independent outfits. Consolidating their already enormous advantages only makes them even more powerful. This Jcpa also treads dangerously into areas best left alone by defining a news content creator as one that has a dedicated professional editorial staff. Independent journalists still make news, but they would be squeezed out by corporate media. Lastly, this issue needs to be seen in context. There are a few journalism bills floating around in this Congress. There's a concerted effort to get government involved in the practice and funding of journalists and journalism. It is unrealistic to expect journalists funded or supported by politicians to turn around and report aggressively on those same politicians. We can't expect journalists to hold powerful people accountable when they are accountable to those powerful people for their paychecks. And all this happens at a time when Americans' trust in media is near an epic low. According to Gallup, Americans' trust in media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly has fallen to just 36%. For Republicans, that number stands at 11%. Why then are we bailing out corporate media when ordinary Americans would rather find news sources of information? Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for appearing remotely. And I'll get started here. I'll start with you, Ms. Bertetto. Google is a search giant. About 90% of searches, as we know, they have 90% market done on Google. And also the largest company in the online advertising space, something I know that my colleague, Senator Lee, is very concerned about. For small newspapers, Google takes a large percentage of the revenue generated on the newspaper site. How would you characterize your negotiations with Google over the share of the advertising revenue it gets compared to what your newspapers can keep?
Thank you for your question. I guess the best way to answer that would be there have never been negotiations between my company and Google about the manner in which we get paid or how much we get paid. In fact, I've often had my company penalized whenever I have had other advertising services available on Trib Live to help fund our free website. We get punished in the algorithm. So if someone goes to search for Trib Live, because we are using other companies that are not Google, our search results are pushed down. When we have reached out directly to Google for help to improve our search rankings, we have been sent to resellers of Google products who charge us anywhere between $12,000 and $15,000 a month, which is a lot for our company, to help us solve our problem. And the problem is always solved by removing other advertising mechanisms that exist on our site. So when I have attempted to find other ways to monetize our content independent of Google, I have hit wall after wall with Google. And in fact, the resellers have been as brash as to say to me, look, I would take off these other platforms that you're using on your site. And when I explain that I actually get a higher dollar per click using those resellers, they told me, well, Google doesn't like that, and Google owns everything.
Okay, pretty direct. Okay, Mr. Oxley, In your written testimony, you wrote that big tech companies like Google have adopted anti-competitive terms of service and a take-it-or-leave-it approach, which leaves local broadcasters with a below-market sliver of the ad revenue derived through their products. Can you tell the committee what's your experience been negotiating with big tech companies like Google?
There is no negotiation. There's no conversation. There's no emails. There's no back and forth whatsoever. They don't really even give you that opportunity in any way, shape, or form. And believe me, we've tried every way possible with both of them. The bottom line is that they don't get back to you. And even worse, they make changes whenever they feel like it. We oftentimes, over a weekend or overnight or in the middle of the afternoon, will all of a sudden have changes in terms of service just come down to us out of the blue, and we just have to deal with it. There's not any kind of negotiation. There's not any kind of conversation.
Okay. Again, direct Dr. Singer. News aggregators such as Apple News, Google News, Facebook News take content from various news publishers and give it to consumers. And it makes it very difficult for newspaper publishers and other news sites to establish direct relations with their own readers, which cuts into their ability to retain subscribers and improve their own advertising operations. Can you talk about the challenges faced by smaller media outlets, which often find themselves in an uneven bargaining position with news aggregators?
Sure. There is the challenge, of course, is more acute for the smaller publishers than the larger, because as a matter of bargaining position, they have even less bargaining power, countervailing power. But I would say that the asymmetry or the power imbalance extends across the entire industry, not just smalls, but the mediums and the large as well. And the fundamental problem is that they cannot summon the will, the publishers cannot summon the will to do what's necessary to extract a fair market payment for access, which is to shut down the access to Google or Facebook from their site. No one would rationally do that on a unilateral basis. The reason why is because they're extremely dependent and beholden on Google and Facebook for traffic. Like I said, 70% of the referrals come from just those two sites. So what the bill would seek to do to attack this power asymmetry, this bargaining asymmetry, is to first allow the newspapers and news publishers and broadcasters to bargain collectively vis-a-vis the dominant platform. So I think that, to answer your question, yes, that they are facing dire straits, and this will
all right, I just want to ask one last question, and that is this. You've heard from, I think it was Mr. Francis and my colleague over here with the use of the word news cartel about what this bill does. And of course, there's been Representative Buck, conservative over in the House, Senator Kennedy, not exactly liberal, Senator Bozeman has just been added to the bill, and there's a lot of interest in this bill. And I think it's really important as we look at the changes we're making to make clear that there isn't going to be any kind of bias here. But that also, could you address this argument they've made that this creates some kind of news cartel? I'm only knowing the supporters of this bill in terms of the news organizations that run the gamut from liberal to very conservative. I find this impossible to see it that way, but could you comment about why this is not a news cartel?
Right. The concept of creating a cartel here is laughable and uneconomic, and let me just try to explain why. The newspapers and the news publishers generally would not be getting coordination rights in their dealings with consumers, would not. If they got together and tried to set prices for end users, they would go to jail. The coordination rights that are being delivered here are narrowly tailored to pertain to only the news publishers' dealings with the dominant platforms. They wouldn't have coordination rights with respect to workers. They wouldn't have coordination rights with respect to buyers or customers. So the notion of a cartel being created is fanciful. I want to just make one other point too. I heard Mr. Francis say that it's going to result in higher prices. As the cartel is going to exercise presumably its selling power vis-a-vis consumers. Well, that's false, but just to think about what would happen if the news publishers got their way and got the bill passed, and there was an arbitration hearing and there was an award that was given in the billions of dollars to the news publishers, what would happen? You would have a large lump sum payment coming in on the revenue side. And there is no theory in economics, or no theory in pricing, which I happen to teach at Georgetown, that would suggest that a big, large increase of a lump sum revenue would ever cause a firm to raise its prices to end users. It just doesn't make any sense as an economic matter. If someone in my class suggested as such, they would fail.
All right. Don't worry, Mr. Francis, when Senator Lee or another senator returns, I myself will give you a chance to respond, so just hold your beer. Okay, so we have next up Senator Durbin. We're thankful he is here as the chair of the Judiciary Committee. We're honored to have him here since he's not officially a member of this subcommittee, but he is our chairman, and we also thank Senator Grassley, the ranking member, for his constant interest in this issue and help. Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have to leave very shortly, and I appreciate your putting me in the queue. I recently read about the brown-headed cowbird is a brood parasite, meaning it lays its eggs in the nests of other species. A female cowbird quietly searches for female birds of other species that are actively laying eggs. Once she's found a suitable host, the cowbird will sneak into the resident bird's nest when it's away, usually damage or remove one or more eggs and replace it with one of her own. The foster parents then unknowingly raise the young cowbirds, usually at the expense of their own offspring. It sounds like an analogy to something we're talking about here. It appears news sources are creating information which is being used by others that they don't pay any money to create, but advertising revenue comes their way when they steal that content and put it on their own tech boards and such. So I'm wondering here, is there a way to deal with this? Let me quote one of the friends of mine, Dennis Lyle. You may know Dennis, president of the Illinois Broadcasters Association. He said to me, the economic harm these tech giants are inflicting on local broadcast journalists around the country is brought out in this testimony, where advertising revenues for radio broadcasters have experienced a free fall in recent years due to almost exclusively the rapid expansion of dominant online platforms who've devoured advertising market share in the digital marketplace and devised anti-competitive practices to protect it. So we're discussing the passage of Jcpa to level the playing field. I'd like to ask Mr. Oxley, can you discuss how this proposal and negotiation framework would help boost small Illinois broadcasters like those Dennis Lyle represents?
Well, absolutely, and I appreciate the question. Absolutely, it would help us to have, and all kinds of news operations, to have a level playing field. I think that's all that we're asking for, is a seat at the table. We want to be able to negotiate. We want to be able to have a conversation. We want to be able to jointly work together to try to have an outcome that will help small journalistic outfits, including broadcasters, but also including the newspaper industry. But in terms of broadcasting, we desperately need this because we're fading away. We're having fewer and fewer people involved in the news business, and we've seen such a dramatic and steep decline in people involved in news that broadcasting now has seen tremendous amounts of people leave the industry.
You know Chicago.
Yes, I do.
You've worked in Chicago.
Yes.
I can tell you in my Senate career of a little over 20 years, there's been a dramatic change. A press conference in Chicago, you're lucky to draw one reporter. Lucky. Instead, it's a bank of cameras, and by union rules or by tradition, the cameramen don't ask questions. So you make your statement, and they look at you, and you look back at them, and that's the end of the story unless you want to start volunteering information and asking yourself questions. That's what it's come to in terms of what used to be one of the most vibrant news markets and competitive news markets in America. It has just disintegrated. We now, incidentally, have a new experiment announced this week where WBEZ, the NPR station in Chicago, is joining up with the Chicago Sun-Times in a not-for-profit venture to deliver regular newspaper journalism with radio journalism through NPR. I wish them well. We need some competition. We need some people that are asking tough questions of politicians like myself. And it's just not the case. And if nothing is changed, it's all going to go away. It's just going to disappear.
And that is my big concern, is that without something like the Jcpa to help out these journalists, we're not going to be able to cover council meetings. We're not going to be able to cover press conferences. We're not going to be able to cover local weather emergencies or traffic, or, you know, all of these things just are going to go away. So what are you going to rely on then? Your local listserv? And the way it's been set up over the years is that, you know, to make it a go at it from the digital business, as I know Jennifer could go into great detail about, it's very, very difficult. The profits just aren't there. You're lucky if you break even. So something has to change if we want local journalism to survive. And the Jcpa, I believe, can get that started by let us have a seat at the table so that we can at least even the playing field.
If we don't do something, the cowbirds won't find even any nest to raid.
They will not.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Francis, first I'd like to let you respond to a point Mr. Singer made a moment ago. I was up in the hall, so I didn't hear all of it, but I think he described, I think the word was as laughable, the point I was making earlier that this bill would authorize cartel behavior. Do you want to respond to that?
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. So I understood Dr. Singer to suggest two things, both of which were pretty surprising to me, and I think anybody sort of in the antitrust enforcement space. So thing number one is the idea that a cartel is only a cartel if it deals with your dealings directly with consumers or workers. That is really not right, and that would be news to the Department of Justice. I think some of the flagship cartel enforcement actions have dealt with cartel agreements to harmonize on prices for sale to intermediate suppliers. I think of the wire harness cartel, the auto parts cartel, the LCD cartel. People went to prison for quite a long time for these things, even though they didn't involve dealings with consumers or workers. It's a routine piece of cartel enforcement.
So his conclusion is based on a distinction that you're saying is not one that's recognized by the antitrust enforcers at the Department of Justice?
Certainly the Department of Justice in cartel enforcement absolutely does not distinguish between cartels for sales direct to consumers and cartels for sales to an intermediate seller, like a platform. They are equally illegal. In addition...
That wouldn't be a defense then?
That would absolutely not be a defense. Second, I understood Dr. Singer to suggest that the cartel overcharge here wouldn't increase prices. It is absolutely true for sure that a one-off lump sum payment would not have any effect on downstream prices. So if what we're talking about here is just cutting a check, a one-time check to Google and Facebook, and then it's back to business as usual forever, that would not, from Google and Facebook, that alone is unlikely to impact downstream costs. But I understand that what we're talking about is an agreement that would lead to a rolling payment from Google and Facebook on an ongoing basis for news-related activity on search engines or social media. And I think it's a pretty elementary piece of textbook microeconomics that if you take a monopolist and you increase their costs, then the profit-maximizing price of the monopolist will increase. And I understand that, not a single one-off lump sum payment, to be what's contemplated here.
Thank you. That's helpful. And just to be clear, getting back to the earlier point about the cartel, it's not like that is just an offshoot ramification of this. That is the point of the bill. Isn't that the primary point of the bill, is to make lawful that which is currently unlawful?
That's exactly how I would understand it. Getting competitors together to agree on the prices and terms with which they'll deal with a trading partner, that's a classic cartel.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Gaynor, isn't the problem for news publishers simply that their value as an advertising venue has been diluted by the advent of the internet and targeted digital advertising?
Well, it's been diluted even before the internet. The Congress passed the Newspaper Preservation Act in 1970, trying to stop newspapers from going out of business back then. We ended up with, I think, more than 24 joint operating agreements back then. People live their lives online in much of the country right now, and 2 years of COVID restrictions have further encouraged that. When people aren't going to advertisers, they aren't going to stores, they aren't going to restaurants, those restaurants and stores stop buying ads, and that affects everybody, the businesses that we're talking about here.
So I've got a chart up behind me. I don't know whether you can see it, but digital advertising revenues have increased several fold, while the areas where newspapers now face more competition, classified ads and retail ads, have declined precipitously. So how much of this is a big tech problem versus how much of it might be a matter of business choices and how they interact with emerging technologies?
I'd say it's a mix of both. I mean, you look at those numbers here. We're all declining. As I said, Baltimore, where I grew up, had 3 newspapers, and Baltimore News American died in 1986 before the internet. The Evening Sun was shut down soon after the internet. That wasn't caused by the internet. So the problem also was news publishers, the biggest ones, didn't reinvest for the future, and now we've seen that the ones that are really doing well are what are called verticals, that are very specialized. New York Times, a political vertical, Washington Post, the same, sports, other things like that. Local news isn't doing as well because it's just not doing well across the board.
Thank you. Mr. Francis, to be clear, when we're talking here about what is at risk, what's at stake, what's suffering, we're not talking about the death of journalism itself. We're not talking about the idea that journalism itself can't be economically viable in the absence of this. We're talking more, I think, about whether certain business models followed by some in the news publishing industry are viable. Is that correct? Is that consistent with your understanding?
I think that's exactly right. I think local news is clearly critical. I grew up in a very small English village where when the Life magazine or the Villager or the Town Crier, our local newspapers would land through our letterbox, everybody in the house at some point that week would read it, and we would learn a bunch of things that we wouldn't find through alternative channels. Local media, local news are clearly critical. But exactly as you describe, what's at stake here is the manner in which local news will survive.
Right.
And it's very clear that the business model is responding to competitive pressures.
And so what that suggests is that some business, not journalism itself that's at stake, but some business models, some businesses will fare better than others in that environment. And so if I have no idea, I'm not a business person, I'm certainly not an expert in the news publishing business. I would never purport to know the ins and outs of that business, but I think it's fair to assume that you can identify a certain subset, I don't know exactly how big it is, a certain subset within the news publishing industry that has adopted a business model that's not succeeding, that's not going to succeed. Is it generally good policy from the standpoint of promoting competition for the government to step in and sanction the formation of a cartel in order to save a particular type of business model that's dying?
It's almost always not, and that is not to say that we look with anything other than horror and sadness at the real difficulties that competitive change brings. So particularly with the transition to digital business models, we've seen from one sector to another legacy business models experiencing real difficulty as they transition to something that makes economic sense and is sustainable in the economy as it's emerging today.
Horse and buggies to automobiles.
Exactly. Video rental stores, film and camera, like we see this story, and there's real suffering associated with that. But if you believe in antitrust, you have to believe in the competitive process that antitrust is there to guarantee. And without tolerating and allowing some degree of failure, some degree of discomfort, even market exit sometimes, then you don't have a competitive process. And then it's not clear what the antitrust project is for. So as difficult as it is, the pains in exactly the way you describe are a necessary part of the competitive process.
No, I like your comparison to the home video industry. The consumption of home video entertainment didn't die. Netflix emerged long before it was an online streaming company, and it survived, where Blockbuster didn't. They had a different delivery mechanism. One worked, the other didn't. It wasn't the industry itself that died. Particular business models succeeded over others. Mr. Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. Thank you all for being here today. There are moments in the United States Senate I've found in my 10 years here that America comes to one of our hearings. Literally, America comes before us, and I think we have that moment today. It is a moment for America about a failing industry that has been the lifeblood of America going back to the founding of our republic, and it is part of the genius of America that we have local journalism which covers local stories and provides a local forum for people to be informed. One of the ironies here is that big tech is using information, in effect, to dominate. And it's information that is collected in all kinds of ways that local journalism simply doesn't have the power to do, and then it is used, in effect, to suffocate other sources of information, namely local journalism, newspapers, and now increasingly broadcast. To all the sophisticated economic arguments that might be made against this act, I think Ms. Bertetto, in her recounting what was told to her, I think, by someone who was asked, Google doesn't like it, and Google owns everything. That's the nature of the power here. And so I would like to say that the market will self-correct, that we can use existing antitrust law, but it ain't working. It isn't working for the Hartford Courant, which was weakened and then taken over, and its fate is uncertain. It was taken over by a vulture hedge fund, Alden Capital, which has been seemingly selling off its assets, taking advantage of its real estate, of other assets, in no way caring about, seemingly, its journalistic staff or even quality. And they've cut staff, in fact, at twice the rate of their competitors. On the bright side, the Connecticut Mirror in Connecticut has enabled vibrant democratic debate and discussion, but it is a nonprofit. It depends on donations. It has discussed in recent times the importance of local elections, and local reporters hold public officials, including myself, accountable to the people that we serve. So, Mr. Singer, let me ask you and any of the other panelists that want to comment. I'm a supporter of this measure, but I wonder, are we too late? Can we still rescue American journalism?
I don't think we're too late, Senator. What this enforcement mechanism would do would provide for a payment to a collective or a coalition of newspapers or news publishers that would attempt to approximate the fair market value of what they are contributing to the platforms in terms of users and clicks and the like. And so if we can put money back into the pockets of the news publishers, I think we can breathe life back into the industry, and that money would eventually redound to the benefit of journalists and all the other workers and input providers that go into the production of news.
Ms. Bertetto and Mr. Oxley, same question to you.
Yeah, I certainly want to respond to that, because I think that what's at risk here really is local news. That's what's really at risk. The huge news operations, yes, they will be just fine. But when you talk about local news is in a lot of trouble, whether it's broadcast or print. And I have experienced it even in the Washington, D.C. area. There is not a viable economic model that I have ever seen for local news to be all digital. It just doesn't work. The money's not there. And so that's very distressing. And over time, I think, while are we too late? No, I don't think we're too late. But we're getting close. We might even be in the 11th hour because it's getting there. This is getting very dire. And I look at it, you know, we're also a platform too. Hey, we're aggregators, and we're good with that, and we understand that. And we're a platform that pays for news content. I don't think the Associated Press would like it very much if all of a sudden we didn't pay for their content. And in many respects, I think that's what's happening here is, you know, the Facebooks and the Googles get all the advantage of it, but don't have to pay for any of the content. And to me, that's just not fair. And it's the downfall, the true downfall of putting out local news. You're just not going to be able to find a revenue model.
Ms. Bertetto?
You know, I can't sit here and pretend that as an industry we have done everything correctly. You know, there are certainly things that over time we have made missteps. But I feel like the Jcpa is one aspect of what needs to happen for our business models to be corrected in the future, but it is one piece. And there is responsibility on each of us as publishers to work on other solutions that make our business successful. So our company, for example, you know, we have gone to great lengths to diversify our revenue streams. And I think it's creative solutions like that that will be necessary from all of us. Jcpa won't fix all of our problems, but it will fix one of them.
Thank you. My time has expired. This topic is urgent in my view because I agree that we are in the 11th hour, maybe even toward the end of the 11th hour, because once these institutions are gone, they are gone. There is no reconstructing them, at least with the quality of excellence that we've seen over so many years in exposing corruption and enabling information about school boards and holding accountable public officials, so importantly at the local level, because it is irreplaceable and indispensable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Blumenthal. I believe Senator Blackburn, who was here diligently early, is now on remotely, and then we go to Senator Padilla, and I think he should be fine for voting. I guess that's my promise. Okay, Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all. What an interesting panel, and I really appreciate the testimony that you got to us and that you came to give today. Mr. Gaynor, I think I want to start with you because your organization has really put up a lot of attention on bias in the mainstream media and how big news and big tech team up and filter the news and really take control of what you hear and what you see when it comes to news. So when I go to Tennessee, I hear a lot about this from Tennesseans, and they don't like it. They feel that their views are not being represented and that they're very concerned about if they can or cannot trust mainstream media. So we thank you for the work that you're doing on this front, but I'd like for you to touch on what small news outlets are doing that will help to combat that bias, what you all are seeing that they're doing. I think it's important that they do that. So if you will just very quickly touch on what are the best place efforts for combating this bias from the coziness of big tech and big news.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Senator. We've seen examples all through even recent the presidential election of the problems of big tech and then followed up by big journalism not covering major issues. And it's fair to note the difference between, you know, corporate media, which what you're talking about there, and several of the people on the panel right now. Local journalism is something I think we all love and is the heart of a community. But on a national level, yes, there's incredible bias from the traditional media, the legacy media, and working hand in hand with the same people that I think we all want to beat up on right now, with Google and Facebook and others. And so the scary idea here of creating a cartel or whatever you want to call it, some sort of organized unit where the major players in journalism, who, the Washington Post, the New York Times, who didn't stand up during the Hunter Biden story and cover that story while New York Post was being censored, that they're going to stand up and represent the little.
Okay, let me jump in there, because see, it is, what we want to do is make certain that local news, that you're going to give local news what they need to be competitive, that you're not going to cut them off. And I think everyone would agree with that. But what we don't want to do is do something that is going to have the unintended consequence of the reverse effect to that. So, Mr. Francis, let me come to you. Do you think that companies like Facebook, like Instagram, YouTube would stand to benefit from an antitrust exemption? And what bad behaviors could they get away with if they did get that exemption?
So my understanding, Senator, is that this proposed exemption would work the other way around. So in the event that this were created, two things would happen. So the first is that the most immediate beneficiaries would be the participating media companies, obviously including some very large conglomerates as well as the smaller publishers that we're talking about. And certainly the cartel overcharge that would emerge from agreements on prices would be paid in the first instance by Google, Facebook, and then transmitted, most likely in the form of higher prices for advertising, down the chain to consumers.
Okay, so basically what you see is more hands in the pot for the money that is there, adding extra layers of fees. So in the end, you're going to have the originator of the content gets no more, but you're going to have the conglomerates reaping more profit off of that content. Am I following what you're saying there?
That's exactly correct. There would be a new monopoly charge at the top.
Yes, let me ask you this. The music industry, when it comes to royalties and some really tricky royalty issues, what we've done through the years is look at how they operate under consent decrees. And a few years ago, we had to work diligently creating the Music Modernization Act. It's something that was very important to a lot of my Tennessee constituents. So do you see something like the music consent decrees being needed if Congress grants an antitrust exemption?
So my sense is, and I am not an expert, it's been many years since I worked on music licensing and the process under the consent decrees that you mentioned. But I'll say a couple things. So thing number one, I think that has been an extremely complicated, difficult, and controversial process for a very long time in a way that I think would exemplify some of the difficulties if we were to embark on a similar price setting mechanism here, for example, with a compulsory arbitration mechanism. And thing number two, many of the music licensing examples are distinctively situated because there's a compulsory licensing obligation. In other words, the licensor has a statutory obligation to issue the license. And obviously that has all kinds of complicated effects for how you want to set up your system. And I don't think anybody is talking about creating a statutory obligation here on news publishers to issue a license. But I am really not an expert on music licensing in particular, so everything that I say about it should be taken with some caution.
I appreciate your candor. Thank you all. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to begin by thanking all the witnesses for your testimony on this very important topic. It is not an understatement to say that our democracy depends on a healthy and vibrant information ecosystem. And this requires, for example, that all of our communities can readily access online news via a high-speed internet connection, a reliable internet connection, that people are equipped with information and media literacy skills responsive to today's complex content streams, and that they're served by a thriving free press that includes media outlets, journalists, and broadcasters that both reflect and are responsive to the diversity of our nation. Economic recessions and a loss of advertising revenue has devastated the news industry. In the last 20 years, more than a quarter of the country's newspapers have disappeared. Local, regional, community, and independent media are understaffed, under-resourced, and in need of assistance as they work to identify new, sustainable business models. It's critical that Congress explore how we can assist the news industry as it tries to find its footing during this transition period. Ms. Bertetto, I know from personal experience that local news is so vital to keeping communities in California informed, particularly during elections, for example, or during and after natural disasters. You touched on it during your opening statement, but can you discuss what's at stake if local and community-facing news outlets disappear, particularly when it comes to our democracy or public safety?
Of course. So our readers, again, being a small publisher in southwestern Pennsylvania, rely on us for the information they are literally not going to get anywhere else. So that is covering school board meetings, that is covering city government, that is letting them know when the bridge is out in their community, that is letting them know when the Senior Citizen Center is going to be open during the cold winter months as heating stations. We often provide that very content as well to the television broadcasters. So often they're relying on us to inform them so they can spread the message through their channels. Obviously, as newspaper staffs continue to dwindle, what will become very problematic is there will be no one. The Washington Post and the New York Times will probably be fine no matter what is decided. But New Kensington, Pennsylvania won't be. Who is going to report on New Kensington, PA if my company isn't doing that? How are we going to have an informed electorate? How are we going to have a society that understands what is happening in local government, state government, and national government if my company is not providing them those resources?
No, thank you. Those are great examples. I appreciate that. Not every bridge failure makes national cable news.
Exactly.
And God only knows how contentious school board meetings are in this day and age. Given the importance of local newsrooms to our democracy, I'm deeply concerned that newsroom employment in the United States has dropped by 26% since 2008. Ms. Bertetto, in your testimony, you stated that the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, the Jcpa, as we're referring to it, would help small publishers make additional investments into the community and hire more reporters. A question for both Ms. Bertetto and Mr. Oxley. Can you discuss the importance of explicitly tying benefits from the bill to job creation and retention?
Presently, in our company, about $7 million is paid out in salaries to journalists on staff. To give you some sense of what we earn presently from Google, it is $144,000 a year. So I really feel I'm starting at zero, and any additional monies that could come in could certainly help to keep reporters on so we can stop this decline, because it's astronomical, the number of reporting positions I'm seeing leave our market. I also think that with when you're looking at $144,000 and say I can get $600,000, just for example, I could cover more communities. I could add beats. I'm presently making decisions every single day about which communities we can afford to have a reporter in. on a full-time basis and where we have to decide to have a part-time reporter or no reporter at all. Any additional economic relief to help me avoid those decisions would certainly be welcome.
Mr. Oxley?
And the same goes for us. Our sizes aren't all that different. Our newsroom costs about $12 million to run every year. And what we're finding is more and more has to be switched to the digital side, even though the digital side really doesn't make us money. At best, over the years, we've broken even. In the last 10 years, our digital overall revenues off of our website have barely moved, and the costs have gone up a lot. So if we were able to have money come in, and I think that the Jcpa could provide that by having a level playing field, having a seat at the table, then we would be investing in reporters. The very thing I get all the time from all of the people on the content side and the programming side is, can I add people? And of course, we would like to add people. Also, our area has grown exponentially. It wasn't that long ago that the whole area in Washington, D.C. was 3 million people. Now it's about 6 million people. Yet our newsroom has not been able to grow in size because we have not been able to really change in terms of growing our people. But the very first thing we would do would be to add more journalists. And the one other thing I would say about the journalists that we would add is they're professional journalists, and I think that is a huge point here. These aren't people who are doing clickbait, or they're people who are researching these stories. They've been educated to do that. They know what they're doing, so they make sure to get it right. We have a saying at our operation: before you get it first get it right. And that means getting good sources. That means verifying. That means doubling, tripling, quadrupling your efforts to make sure that you've got it right before you put it out. And that way, people get the facts. And that's what people need in local news.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just in closing, I know the conversation has also gone in the direction of what else the industry is doing to find solutions, short-term and longer-term, during this transition period. And I'd invite the ongoing conversation of what else Congress can be doing, both in the short term and the longer term, to help the news industry. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Senator Padilla. I think it's down to just Senator Lee and myself here, and I'm going to have to leave at about 5 to 5. And so I'm going to let him maybe do 5 minutes or so. I'll have 2 more questions, and we could go from there.
Thank you. Mr. Gaynor, let's go back to you, if that's all right. How do you believe consumer trust or distrust of news publishers might impact their success? I ask because the Edelman Trust Barometer, as displayed in the chart behind me, shows a growing mistrust of the media across the globe. Edelman reported this year that 46% of people around the world view government and media as divisive forces in society, and 74% of Americans worry about fake news. How do you think political bias, or including anti-conservative censorship, might have contributed to that mistrust?
I think it helps contribute to it a lot, both on the big tech side and on the media side. And again, that's when you're talking about large media outlets, corporate media, it's not a slam on local news. But when ordinary Americans think about media, they're generally not thinking about their local news outlet, their weekly newspaper, their radio station. They're thinking about larger media. They're thinking about the media they see on TV. And then they're also thinking about the problems of big tech. I mean, if this committee or others want to go to war with big tech, I think conservatives would be very happy about that. But the question is, does this bill work to do that? And when you look at the years of gradual decline of people's interest in media, and then you also look at the rising tide of people distrusting media, the two track very similarly.
And that makes some intuitive sense, and there seems to be anecdotal support for that. At least intuitively, it makes sense to me. Now, the Congressional Research Service has noted that 70% of daily newspapers are owned by private equity firms, hedge funds, or other investment groups. Nothing wrong with those business models, but those are the data that I've got. Now, do you think these owners are necessarily going to be more concerned about investing in journalists and quality journalism than they are about getting a return on investment? And regardless, would the Jcpa make a difference in that regard? Is the Jcpa going to change the incentives in place for the owners of these businesses one way or another?
Well, it certainly doesn't seem like it. I mean, you look at the Washington Post, for example. The Post its identity as a national newspaper. When it owned a chain of weeklies that were very popular in suburbia, it shut them down. When Tribune owned the Baltimore Sun, they had a chain of weeklies that they gutted to the point where they're largely non-existent now. That's been an ongoing problem. Not necessarily the local ownership. Local ownership, which I think is reflected on this panel, local ownership tends to care about the local community. And, but when it's national ownership, and you were saying 70%, then they're not necessarily loyal to their readers or their viewers.
Mr. Oxley, well, I'm never going to support legislation that I believe attempts to improve competition by forming a cartel, as this one does. If the purpose of something like the Jcpa is to protect small and independent local publishers, then why not at least limit the bill's scope? Why not limit its application to small and independent local publishers?
Well, I don't know the ins and outs of that as well as an awful lot of people in this room, and I haven't been able to look at the ins and outs of the bill and how it works.
Are you saying that you would support it if it were so limited?
Well, I would certainly support anything that would help local news. I feel at this point that we're in a really, really tough spot with local news. And that's, to me, what we're really talking about here. We're not talking about the national news players. Local news players are still some of the most trusted in America. Study after study shows that your local news people are trusted and that there's actually a very favorable view of them. The national is a different story, but locally, and we need something to help out, truly help out the local news providers.
So but if that's the case, if we are going to make it, as most of this discussion today has been, if we are going to make it about the local folks, then why not limit it to them? Dr. Francis, I assume you'd agree with the suggestion that if you buy into the notion that creating a cartel or a type of cartel permission slip is acceptable for one universe, you could reduce the harm inflicted by that universe where cartels are authorized by reducing the scope. And in this case, since most of the discussion has focused around small, independent, local publishers, couldn't that have that effect?
I think that's exactly right, Senator. So as you've heard, I have pretty strong feelings about cartels, but I don't object in principle anything like so much to the idea of supporting local, struggling news publishers. So at a minimum, restricting the scope of what you're describing, restricting in the way you describe the scope of the exemption so that it's truly targeted at small, struggling publishers. That means we can avoid conferring the ability to, add a cartel overcharge to large, very profitable media companies. That would really help. I am pretty uncomfortable at this moment in our sort of political life about taking a big bite out of antitrust when we should be reinforcing it. So I would love to be talking about other ways to support local news, but any support mechanism should be targeted to those who really need it, not to the most prominent publishers.
And is there a risk that by focusing on this particular issue, it might draw attention away from other things that also need to be addressed, including the problem we've got with Google and Facebook?
I think digital monopoly and monopoly in general is a problem that at the minute vastly overmatches the ability of our antitrust agencies. I would love to see more funding and more resources. I think that's the most urgent need we have as a competition policy community in this country. Even more urgent than antitrust reform is money and personnel for the agencies. And that's where I would love the focus of the conversation to be. That's what I think is top of the wish list.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee, and thank you for, I'm sure you have other questions for the record, so thank you. And Mr. Francis, that's something where we agree on the funding for the agencies. And as you probably know, Senator Grassley and I have a bill that passed the Senate, actually, to change the merger fees, actually make it easier for smaller mergers and harder for bigger ones, maybe not harder, but just a little more expensive, to help pay for the agencies to be able to do their reviews, as well as some other funding mechanisms that we're working on. A few things, I'm just going to ask a few questions here at the end, and be brief here. Dr. Singer, I have to go now work on the Electoral Count Act. Dr. Singer, in your opinion, should news organizations have a right to be compensated when digital platforms take in profit from detailed snippets? I think it's a little more than snippets of their copyrighted content. This is the they are claiming it's fair use, and I'd like your response.
Right. Yes, they should be compensated for any value that is being conferred from the newspapers to the platforms, including when the platforms scrape and index and use rich text and images to decrease the likelihood of a user actually clicking on the link. I'd like, if I could, just to address the cartel pricing increase that Mr. Francis keeps saying, which doesn't make sense as an economic matter. He did admit, and I think it's the most important admission today, that if there was a one-time lump sum transfer from the platforms to the newspapers as a coalition, there would be no price increase by the newspapers. I think he did admit that. That's the most important admission that we heard today. Now, what he said next, which was uneconomic again, was that if it were to recur every 5 years, then there would be a price increase of some sort. I can't follow what the economic logic is, and maybe he's talking about a price increase by the platforms, but I want to rebut that as well, because the platforms, as you know, Senator, has used a free price, a zero price model to consumers. The notion that the platforms having to write a check of, say, $5 billion every year for the payment of access is going to induce them to suddenly abandon their free model and start charging consumers access for search or charging consumers access to the Facebook social platform is uneconomic. I can't say it any nicer than that. But there will be no cartel price effect from this lump sum transfer. You can take my word for it.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Singer. Just some quick questions about some of the concerns that we've heard, and of course, I mentioned we're making revisions with the House to the bill. Are there changes we should consider to ensure that small and local news organizations benefit from joint negotiations and can exert an appropriate level of control over the process?
Yes, I understand there are certain provisions in the bill that would protect small publishers that we're asking. And the most important that comes to mind is the non-discrimination provision. So a small newspaper that wanted to apply to become a member of the coalition could not be discriminated against based on its size or on its viewpoint. That's very important. That is, they could get access to the bargaining coalition. The second thing, I understand there are voting rights, one member, one vote. So it's very important that smaller newspapers who are members of the coalition must be protected, and their interests must be protected that way.
Should we also consider changes to prevent discrimination? This has been raised by some of my colleagues in the joint negotiation process against news outlets carrying content that expresses different or even unpopular views, whether they are from the left or the right. And I note that we have support for this bill. Some of my colleagues have noted from news organizations that they consider left, and then we have support from letter in support of the bill, Washington Examiner, Washington Times, Daily Caller. Not exactly a bastion of liberal organizations. So could you respond to that, if there's some provision we could put in to ensure that there is no bias?
The provision, again, is the non-discrimination provision. So any coalition of newspapers that forms would not be able to exclude a member based on their viewpoints, plain and simple.
Okay. And if joint negotiations with the dominant platform stall, should Congress consider providing for binding arbitration to resolve the impasse?
Yes, binding arbitration is critical here because it is possible for Google or Facebook to check all the boxes and abide by the good faith protections during the good faith negotiation period. So it's very important that they look down the road and see that if they do that, they are going to be faced with binding arbitration, again, at which point a panel of, say, 3 arbitrators would make a determination as to whose estimate of the fair market value was fairest of them all, most closely approximated the value being conferred by the news publishers onto the platform.
Okay, that's one proposal. Thank you as we finish up this bill. So I also would like to enter a set of more than 36 letters from newspapers, news organizations into the record. Those letters focus on the state of competition in journalism and the need for solutions like the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which is bipartisan both in the Senate and the House. We also have a letter from Lee Enterprises, no relation, discussing the challenges the industry faces from those who would exploit it for short-term profit opportunities, as well as a few others. I'll put those in the record. I want to thank you all for being here. Local news is of foundational importance to our democracy. I want to thank our witnesses today for their testimony. So many senators from different parties, different views, as you can see, came together today. That's part of the exercise of free speech and part of being a senator. And Senator Lee and I truly enjoy doing these hearings and really appreciate it. I want to get something done here. That is my goal. And we want to make it work for this country. So the record will remain open for 1 week until February 9th. Thank you. You want to add anything, Senator Lee? Are we good? Okay. Well, thank you very much to all of you. I'm going to run to this other thing. Thank you.
Good hearing. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.